Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the economy in China because Chinese businesses are continuing to suffer from margin erosion. And this is an absolute disaster from China's perspective because Chinese businesses have very thin margins in the first place. And if these margins are now being cut, then many businesses in China have now actually fallen into a loss making situation. I've talked about it before. But more than 50% of the companies in China are now estimated to be banking losses. And clearly, from an economy's point of view, that's not good news because if you're posting losses, you don't pay any taxes, and that will drag down GDP growth in China. The Chinese authorities have said that they're going to hit 5% again in 2026, but I think there is a major question mark over whether or not that is realistically achievable. If we have a look at this table, it shows what's been happening with producer prices over the past 12 months. And the scale on the right hand side here starts at zero and goes down to minus 4%. And as you can see, in every single one of the past 12 months, Chinese producers have been cutting their prices. This chart is also referred to as the factory gate prices. So, this is the price of products when they're leaving Chinese factories. And the latest data for January 26 shows that year on year, prices were down by 1.4%. Now, if you put that into the context of your economy, if prices were going down by 1.4%, then you'd be very happy as a consumer because that means that you're paying less at the tills. But as a company, this is an absolute disaster because the reason why we want some form of inflation in the economy is because it allows companies to pass on their cost increases because everybody wants to get paid more. So you want a wage increase. That's the same in China. And also the cost of things like electricity and water and raw materials that you're using in your processes goes up year on year. So you need to be able to pass on those cost increases. But if your end price is going down by 1.4%, then clearly you can't pass on those cost increases. You have to absorb them. And this is why Chinese businesses are seeing their profit margins being wiped out. And if we widen the scale of this chart to show the last 5 years, you can start to see the scale of the problem in China because producer prices, factory gate prices, have now been falling since May 2022. Can you remember what you were doing in May 2022? It was a very long time ago. It was almost 4 years ago. So, what we've got here is a compounding of year on year falls in factory gate prices. We have a look at this table I've put together. It shows what the impact of this has been on the sales price for a product. So, if we assume that January 2022, which was the last time that we saw a price increase year on year in China, if we assume that a product that Chinese company was selling for $100 at that time, this shows what the impact has been on that product. So in the year to January 23, prices fell by 0.8%, producer prices. So that means that that $100 product would have then been selling for $99.20. In January 24, the year on year fall was 2.5%. So that $100 product would then would have been selling for 96.72. In 25, there was a 2.3% fall in producer prices. So that product by then would have been down to $94.50. And the 1.4% that we've just seen posted means that that $100 product that was being sold in 2022 would now be selling for $93.17. So this really puts into perspective the problem that Chinese companies are going through at the moment. Now, just before we go on any further today, could I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that subscribe button? It really helps me with the algorithm and also puts a smile on my face. And also wanted to remind you that I'm currently running my competition whereby you can win my property located close to one of the best beaches in the UK or a cash alternative prize. You can scan the QR code on the screen now or click the link in the description below. Now, you might be thinking, well, isn't this just down to what's happening with inflation? Didn't you tell me that there's deflation going on in China? So aren't all prices going down? Well, this chart shows what's been happening with inflation over the past 12 months in China. And as you can see, it has been a bit of a mixed story. The scale on the right-hand side here goes from 1% positive at the top to 1% negative at the bottom. And as you can see, in 6 out of the past 12 months, prices did actually fall, but they've been increasing over the past 4 months. And you can see that the latest data that we have for January 26 shows that year on year, prices are up by 0.2%. So that doesn't explain the 1.4% fall in producer prices in January 26. And we widen the scale of this chart to show the past 5 years. You can see that whilst there has been a few months where we've seen deflation, it's predominantly been inflation in China. So it's relatively low level compared to other countries. So we're talking between 1 and 2%, so a lot less than we've seen in the West over the past 5 years. But we've still seen prices going up. And if we have a look at this table, it shows what's happened to prices over the same period. So if we assume the same $100 product in January 2022 that we just looked at for producer prices, in 23, prices actually went up by 2.1%. So that product would have been selling for $102.10 at that time. We saw deflation in January 24, which would have brought the price back down to 101.28. In 25, we saw a year-on-year increase of 0.5%, so it would have pushed that price to 101.79. And the most recent data for January 26 of 0.2% increase tells us that that product would now be selling for 101.99. So an increase in the price. And if we have a look at the comparison between those two tables, then you can see here the producer prices between January 22 and 26. The $100 product has gone from $100 to $93.17. That's what the companies are receiving for that same product. At the same time, inflation has gone up by 1.99% over that period. So that pushed up the price to 101.99. So the gap between those two metrics, what's been happening with inflation, if producer prices had just been moving at the same rate as inflation, the difference between the two is $8.82 over the past 5 years. So that represents lost profit margin for Chinese businesses over the past 5 years of 8.6%. So that's how much profit has been taken out by the fall in producer prices compared to what should have been happening if they were matching inflation. Now, why is this happening? What's going on in China? Why are Chinese businesses constantly cutting their prices when prices in the domestic market are going up? Well, there's a number of reasons for it, but one of the main reasons is down to overcapacity. So Chinese industry has been gearing up heavily over the past 20 years. So in areas where China believes that it's strong, it's put a lot of investment, and the government has subsidized a lot of these companies in many situations to enable them to grow rapidly, to take a dominant global market position. So we have got some huge businesses in sectors where China has tried to become dominant. If we have a look at this table, it shows the different industries in China that are the biggest in terms of revenue and what that should mean in terms of profitability for those businesses. So the biggest sector in terms of manufacturing is computers, electronics, and telecom equipment. So I'm sure you've seen lots of different equipment that's been made in China over the past 20 years. It's estimated that that sector has revenue of around about 2.2 trillion US dollars. And that should be equating to around about 165 billion of profits. The usual profit margin is around 7.5% for Chinese businesses in those sectors. But those sectors are currently under a lot of pressure. Firstly, we've seen its biggest single market, the USA, applying tariffs against Chinese imports. So that's causing problems because it's pushing up the price. And in order to counteract those tariff increases, some Chinese businesses have actually been cutting their costs to absorb some of those tariffs. But also, we're seeing competition from the rest of the world. So Chinese businesses are constantly slashing their prices to be the cheapest on the shelf because realistically, that's why a lot of consumers choose the Chinese option. If you've got a product made by Apple and the product made by a Chinese producer, then the main reason why you're probably going to buy the Chinese option is because it's a lot cheaper than the Apple product, for example. So that sector is under pressure at the moment. So that's one of the reasons why those companies are cutting back on their prices. Now, another area which is absolutely huge for Chinese businesses is electric vehicles, batteries, and solar. So this is an area that China has really specialized in. It's cornered the market in batteries and solar panels. That's most of them are made in China these days. But also electric vehicles, it decided to take a big slice of the global market. And those electric vehicles are being sold at very low prices compared to local competition. So if you compare a Chinese electric vehicle, the actual list price of that versus things like BMW, Volkswagen, Ford, they are a lot cheaper. That's one of the reasons why a lot of countries have been applying tariffs on the electric vehicles. So this is aside from Donald Trump's tariffs. We're talking about the whole industry globally is saying that it's not fair that EVs are being subsidized. But in terms of revenue, it's around about 1.9 trillion US dollars for China. And the usual profit margin's around about 7% on that. But they're under a lot of pressure because of the tariffs. Now, a lot of countries are saying that China is trying to put the rest of the world out of business so that it can become completely monopolistic in these areas. So they're under high pressure, and that's another reason why Chinese companies are cutting their prices. Now, interestingly, if we jump down to some of the things that are related to property. So we look at ferrous metals, which are basically steel. China has some of the biggest steel smelting plants in the world. It's a big producer of steel. And the revenue is about 1.3 trillion. Now, the profit margin on steel is wafer thin, 2.2%. And the problem that China has is twofold at the moment. Firstly, a lot of that steel was being sold into the Chinese market for the property market, because the property market over the past 25 years was booming. The first 20 years of the 21st century, it was absolutely on fire. Lots of massive property developers like Evergrande were building whole cities all across China, and they were using a huge amount of steel to do that. They were building these huge tower blocks, and you have to put a lot of steel in there. Now, as you'll know if you've been following the channel, the property sector has absolutely crashed in China over the past few years. Since the government changed the rules and made it more difficult for property developers to borrow money, there hasn't been anywhere near as much production. So that's caused a huge drop-off in demand in China for steel itself. So that's meant that Chinese steel businesses have had to look to the export markets. But similar to what's been happening in the electric vehicle market, a lot of countries, including the USA, have pushed back on Chinese steel imports because they are so cheap that they are killing local steel production. And in the UK, the British government had to recently take over the last virgin steel producer in the UK to make sure that it could actually produce steel that was needed for things like the defense sector. So we've seen a major attack globally on the whole steel industry, and lots of countries have pushed back on that. So the steel industry in China is now under a lot of pressure. It's struggling with regards to demand, and those profit margins have been wiped out. But we've got a lot of different sectors here that are under intense pressure at the moment from competition. And that's one of the factors why Chinese businesses are cutting their prices. In addition to that, Chinese businesses are also seeing weak demand at home. So that's meaning that Chinese consumers are not buying as much stuff as they used to. So Chinese companies are cutting their prices to try to encourage consumers to keep buying. And as that demand falls at home, what that means is that Chinese businesses are having to depend on the export markets more so. Chinese companies are struggling with regards to its biggest single market because the USA has hit all Chinese imports with additional tariffs. So that's led to a further cutting of prices. And Chinese businesses basically across the board are geared up for high volume, low margin. And when demand starts to fall, then the only thing that you can do is cut your price, because if you've got a huge fixed cost business, if you've spent billions building up your business, maybe it's lots of machinery, you've got lots of people, you've got huge factories, you need to hit those volume numbers just to keep the wafer thin profit margins going. But unfortunately, if demand starts falling, you can't cut back on your costs because these are very high fixed cost businesses. So, what Chinese businesses are doing instead is slashing their prices to maintain their volume of sales. But that is wiping out their profit margins. And that's why many Chinese businesses, over 50%, are now banking losses. And of course, this is an absolute disaster from the Chinese economy point of view because it needs those companies to keep contributing, to make profits, to pay taxes, to contribute to GDP in order to hit that 5% GDP total. But unfortunately, what we're seeing from the data that's just been published is that producer prices are continuing to fall. Inflation is still very, very low in China. Consumer demand is very weak. So China remains dependent on the export markets. Many export markets are pushing back against Chinese imports, which is meaning that Chinese businesses are having to cut their prices, which is further reducing their profit margins. Many have moved into losses, and this is a complete nightmare, vicious circle from many of these companies' perspective. And I can't see how they're going to get out of this situation, certainly not in 2026. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If you have liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Don't forget I'm currently running my competition whereby you can win my property located close to one of the best beaches in the UK or a cash alternative prize. So if you'd like to get involved in that, please scan the QR code on the screen now. Thank you so much to everyone that supported me in other ways. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, really appreciate that support. Thank you so much. And here's something to put a smile on your face.